My name is Jonathan Taylor, and this is my presentation for our timeline in special ed. Before we start getting too deep into all of the groundbreaking laws and acts that took place in order to get special ed to look like the way it does today, I felt that it was important to first take a trip and look at what special ed really looked like ahead of any kind of legislation. And I want to start with the original intent for schools. Horace Mann, supposed to be a revolutionary thinker who felt that, hey, we were going to have immigrants coming to the country from all different walks of life and all kinds of different beliefs. He felt, hey, why don't we take our tax dollars and let's build these schools so that everyone gets the same doctrine, everyone's on the same place, same space, and it's going to bring people together. So we start taking a look at what special education classes might have looked like in the 1800s, the approach to it. Well, really, there weren't really programs to address different types of learning styles. As a matter of fact, it was really more just programs in order to kind of curb the idea of delinquency and the at-risk children that lived in urban slums. The early special education programs, it focused primarily on the moral training of African American children. I bring this up for a reason, not because I'm African American, but it's going to play into something bigger in just a little bit. Special ed looked like people being put in privately held facilities, asylums, residential homes. There was really no consistent standards in terms of how we're going to work with people with disabilities state to state. States were left to their own devices to come up with whatever worked for them. And for a lot of children who might have been classified for special education, there just wasn't anything available. Okay. And to further make things difficult and more challenging, in 1896, the passing of Plessy versus Ferguson was a case that was, in theory, set to just segregate blacks and whites, provided, they're going to have equal learning environments, just they're going to be separated. And of course, they weren't exactly equal. But the interpretation of that law, it pigeonholed even students with disabilities. Okay, because in reality, the learning environments weren't equal. Okay, there were rundown places for the black people and there were nicer places for the white people, essentially. And it pigeonholed people who had disabilities because the majority of the people who were classified for those who would have qualified for special ed, again, the majority were African Americans. So Plessy versus Ferguson while it was designed to keep blacks and whites segregated, it also hurt people with special needs just as a whole, because basically their interpretation of anyone with special needs was basically black, which hurt anybody else who legitimately was not black and had special needs. It kept them from getting any kind of help. So that pigeonholed the whole situation for special ed. We move into 1919, probably one that's not really spoken of a lot, but it just lends to the mentality of the country at this time. We look at Beatty versus the Board of Education of Antigua, and this is out of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Let's take a look at this incredible quote. It says, "The very sight of a child with cerebral palsy will produce a depressing and nauseating effect upon others." Even the Supreme Court of the United States, when it comes to the issue of this idea of involuntary sterilization, okay, check this out. And I quote, "It's better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit for continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." says one Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. And this is in the case of Buck versus Bell. Well, stating on anybody who they viewed as special to be in a classroom with everybody else who was considered normal. And so here's why the groundbreaking Brown versus Board of Education ruling was such a big deal. This is the part where we start getting into the shaping of special ed the way we see it. We are at the date of this recording. It is the 5th of May, 2024. On the 17th of this very month, it's going to be 70 years since this landmark decision was made. Brown versus the Board of Education, and it really challenged policies around Plessy versus Ferguson and segregating the schools. Is it really separate but equal? The language of the 14th Amendment gets to be challenged in this a little bit. And it was essentially decided that, yes, it created a disadvantage. And the language in the passing of this particular law was written in such a way that you almost couldn't misinterpret it. Like, you just have to be a complete and total buffoon if you just didn't get it. Okay. It was determined, okay, that any public schools, like public education, it had to be offered on equal terms. Everybody had to be able to get, it had to be the same. And this was something that was going to be created for all students. And by all, that also included students with disability. So just like Plessy versus Ferguson inadvertently hurt special education, Brown versus the Board of Education inadvertently became a huge win for the proponents of special education. And this became the legal precedent from which it just totally reformed that particular sector of education. Like, without Brown versus Board, we don't have a lot of these other ones that we're going to talk about. 1958, we look at the Expansion of Teaching in the Education of Mentally Retarded Children Act. Whew, that's a mouthful, okay? But we don't talk about this one a whole lot, or I don't see it spoken about a whole lot, but the significance of this one is the fact that it's the first time that the federal government gets involved in the field of special education. This act, it made grant money available for public schools, for nonprofit organizations. It made money available to train professionals to work with this community of people. It made money available to train teachers to work with, as they worded it, mentally retarded children. And under the act, states were also authorized to make these types of grants happen. So 1958, again, just 4 years after Brown versus Board of Education, now the feds are getting involved with the game. We moved to 1973, Rehabilitation Act is passed. And the significance of this one is that it really declared civil rights for individuals with disabilities. It really spoke about what's gonna fly and what's not gonna fly. It prohibited discrimination on the basis of disability and programs that are conducted by the federal government in federal agencies. Important with this is that limitations weren't put in place based off of medical examinations and confidentiality around medical conditions, which is just something that even those without disabilities get to participate with even now. Jobs had to make some reasonable accommodations, and we see that in many of our job applications today. There's the question around being able to do the duties that are required for the position with or without some reasonable accommodations. It became the template for the American Disabilities Act later on in the 90s, and that act prohibited discrimination against qualified candidates for jobs, regardless of disabilities, and this actually impacted the private work sector. Then next, Congress enacted the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act, the EAHCA. This is where we start to see IEPs come into the mix. We got to start evaluating the needs of the children formally. Got to involve the parents, educate the disabled child in an environment with those who are not disabled as often as possible. So we're not, again, segregating. We're creating equal opportunities for all of our students. In the 90s, the name of this law became IDEA, Individuals with Disability Education Act. And This one has been reauthorized and re-upped several different times, just as recent as 2004. And this one really hones in on the idea of making sure that we're making free and appropriate public education available for all of our students. Also in the 70s, Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Citizens, the Park versus Pennsylvania. Now, prior to this law passing, Pennsylvania, that state law allowed public schools to deny services to children. Okay, if they didn't reach the mental age of 5 years of age or better, then they basically just didn't have to let their kids go to school. In Mills versus the Board of Education, Pennsylvania, basically they said they didn't have a problem with the idea of all students being educated as long as Congress made the money available to them. But my man, 50 grand, Judge Joseph Cornelius Waddy. Now, he said, wait a minute. He said, not so fast. In a nutshell, his ruling, which is one that still pretty much stands today, he essentially said that, hey, use the funds that you do have, okay? And you're going to spread that money out equitably among all of your kids in your school. And we're not going to entirely exclude anybody. We go into the 80s. We have the Board of Education versus Hendrick Hudson Central School District. And then, that's versus Raleigh. Again, that's the Board of Education of Hendrick Hudson Central School District. Try to say that 10 times. Okay, so this is the first special education case decided by the Supreme Court. And in this case, the court held that an IEP must be reasonably calculated for a child to receive educational benefits. So don't just be writing stuff down on paper saying that, yeah, we got an IEP. You got to be beneficial. You got to push the needle a little bit for that student. It also meant that the school district is not required to provide every service necessary to maximize the child's potential, but we got to show up and we got to do something out. In 1984, Urban Independent School District against Amber Tatro, the court held the provision of clean intermittent catheterization. This is a related service under IDEA, and it was not a medical service. So this becomes important because some students, they need additional help with restroom services. And it was determined that it's not necessarily a medical need that needs to be performed by a physician. We take a look at the haunted case of 1988. It allowed schools to only suspend a child for no more than 10 days, and this is going to be without parental consent or without court intervention. So if we've got a student who's gotten violent, we've got a student whose behavior is inappropriate, and it's a direct result of the behavior disability, schools are not allowed to just expel that kid, and they can't suspend them for more than 10 days. Now, if that student's behavior is like ultra violent, they can do up to 45 days. And if they want to remove that student and move them to a different school, or if they want to expel that student, then we have to have an IEP meeting. And we have to be able to also prove that there's a causal relationship between the student's behavior and the misconduct. This has become known as the Manifestation Determination Review. Then we get into one of my favorite ones that I like to talk about, and it's No Child Left Behind. And this one gets talked about not because it was particularly written for students with disabilities, but it just had a profound impact on special education. And I'm going to also say general education as a whole. And I just want to go on the record to state that I just feel that this law at best was very idealistic. I feel like its premise and the execution was flawed from the start. The basic premise was the idea that all children, they should be able to obtain a high quality education. And I mean, who's not for that? I'm all for that. That's great. But then they got to be able to prove the quality of the education by being able to pass state assessments. So loosely translated, that meant that you got to be able to pass the state exam to get your high school diploma. And I got a problem with that. It's been demonstrated time and time again that these assessments, they just don't reflect actual learning. Many people, they're just poor test takers. And if we we look at our students in special ed who are generally taught differently, they learn differently, but these assessments, they didn't make any concession really for them to test differently. So it was already set up it just wasn't going to work very well. The other assumption, No Child Left Behind asserted that all students in every district in the country they're funded, and they're resourced the same. Okay, so look, the school in Beverly Hills, they're going to be funded far better than many schools in the inner city, like Compton or South LA. And that meant that the school in Beverly Hills, they had more supplemental support to offer because they had a larger budget to do that than the inner city schools had access to. And the best that the IDEA could do to conform to No Child Left Behind was require highly qualified teachers to lead special education classes. And you got to think back at this point in time, we're looking at the early 2000s. Education was not the field that everyone was flocking to. And then they decided to say, hey, we've got a shortage of teachers and we have a shortage of special education teachers too. Let's just make it even harder for people to get into the field. It just wasn't good. So 2015, Obama, he modified the statute and he modified the requirement for highly qualified teachers, and he got rid of that state test in order to graduate. That just wasn't going to work really well. So where does this journey take us today in 2024? Well, I can honestly say that I feel that we're in a better place than things were at in the 1800s. I still believe that African Americans and students of colors are disproportionately classified as special ed. I think there's still more work that needs to be done with that. According to the Department of Ed, there's a report that came out in June 2020 that indicates that fewer than half of the states are in compliance with federal special education laws. So we still have a lot of work to do. We still have a lot of compliance issues. We still have to do better with classifying our students. We have to do better at those students who get overlooked, who really need the services, but they're never identified. There's still much work that needs to be done. However, I do feel like a lot of work has been done. And if I had to have a child of my own in special ed in 2024, I would prefer to have to make that decision in 2024 versus 1944. All right, so this has been our journey for the timeline for special education. And I will make sure that all of the notes are annotated on the next screen. Thank you.